Are you ready to go?
Yep. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first live stream of FPL Script. This is the international break episode and season 2, episode 10 of the podcast. I'm your co host, JD, also known as at the Red Schadenfreudist on Twitter with a one instead of an I. Um, well, this has been quite a boring international break so far, I think,
Yeah.
except for maybe the World Cup of crisps and the World Cup of most annoying people or Twitter personalities that's been going on. But and also I think Fran is participating in some taskmaster challenge that maybe he can talk about later. uh, he apparently he won the second challenge that was issued to
I
the
did.
contestants, so
Did
so good on
indeed.
him. Yeah. And other than that, both of us had smashing game wickets. Fran, of course, played the wild card, and he will take you through how his wild card went. For me, I also got, I think, about 100% green arrow. I didn't play my wild card. I've kept it for game week 10 as of now. So, for anyone listening on the podcast, I had Turner in goal, Trippier, Pedro Porro, Saliba. So, clean sheets essentially. I know Trippier didn't get a clean sheet, but 6 points. And in midfield, I have Madison, Bruno Fernandes, vice captain, Son captain, so captaincy blank, Mbeumo, and Sterling, who was the star of my team. And strikers, I had Alvarez and Holland, who both blanked, obviously, which was a good thing because at least Holland blanking was a good thing because both of us had bet against his massive EO. And it did even feel like we got away with it because he didn't get a sniff in the game. So, it's a good move, looks like it in hindsight as well as in foresight. Uh, and yeah, looking forward to Game Week wildcard, Game Week 10 wildcard. How about you, Fam?
Yeah, so I think my week was interesting because by Saturday, I actually thought I had a terrible week because Sterling had hauled. I had owned
Yeah,
Sterling previously. I had even owned Pickford previously. So the only difference really with your team that did really well, 61 points you did, was the fact that I had Dallo in place of Saliba, but then obviously Pickford had 3 points, over Turner, for example. So that was some points. And then Madison was another player that I didn't own. I would have probably continued to own Rashford, which would have looked a lot worse in hindsight. So I think because I captained Salah, I'm feeling a lot happier about my week. But yeah, there was a point obviously at Saturday where I thought the week was terrible and the wild card was outcome terrible. But I'm sort of happy that I did move on through certain players and also sort of invested into, for example, a Spurs team, which I'm quite happy with. Because I understand substantially, I think when I look back at the wild card, that whatever week you're wild carding, 8, 9, 10, it's really you're sort of tripling up on different teams, right? For example, 8 is sort of a week where you triple up on Spurs. 9, you could argue it's a week to dip back into United. 10 is a great week to go into Arsenal, but you could already just invest already by game week 9 as well. So that's why when we look at a game week 9 wild card, for example, I think people who have the chance to do so probably won't be jumping into United, as I mentioned, just because of their performances so far, as opposed to, let's say, rejecting the fixtures outright. It's just the reality that, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that United really are playing so bad that their baselines are actually dropping, and therefore it even
yeah,
makes sense
yeah,
to jump ahead of the curve, go for Arsenal assets now. So, kind of happy I jumped off of those United assets, but I am still, for example, in a bit of a conundrum in terms of I do think Richarlison obviously has to be my transfer out, but the question is going to be who I take out as well so that I can move Richarlison into Saka. Now, I have a couple ideas. It's really just Trippier out for someone like Gabriel or Son out for someone like Saka. And then Richarlison can be Martinelli, for example, in the Son example, and obviously in the Trippier example, just to pair up Gabriel and Saka and switch out Trippier, which feels actually a little bit worse now. It is actually my top line on review, but I'm actually leaning towards potentially Martinelli and Saka in my mind, just because I think Martinelli's minutes will be quite good for the time being.
yeah. Sorry, I just saw that Spain has scored again.
Yeah.
So, just for context, both of us are massive Spain fans, and finally, good to see that we are beating Scotland. And before Fran proceeds, one big news from an FPL point of view was that Robertson has apparently broken his arm, or there's like a potential for a serious injury in that game. So be on the lookout for that. Also, FPL Mess says, good morning, good morning. We're going to be looking at the chat as much as we can, but also I don't want to interrupt Fran's flow of thought.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Obviously, morning to Mez and good evening to Mo, who's following Spain's game right now. I think Oyhan Sansei just scored. So, and also apparently that this Erling Haaland guy is actually scoring goals. So quite a shock to me actually,
Mm,
given that I wildcarded into him. Really good player, I've heard.
mm.
But yeah, who knows? Some people say
Maybe,
not so optimal, but
maybe a
um,
differential captain
yeah,
against Brighton is on the cards, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That 3% of ownership that he's lost is it's gonna take a beating on his effective ownership next week.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But actually, I mean, the title of the show obviously is it's a season review, an early season review. Not even hit the, for example, quarterly Q1 target, but we are
Ooh,
here to deliver on our earnings early. Fortunately, I think both of us have come into this week with green arrows, so we're a little bit more keen on doing this than some might
yeah,
be. But I
yeah.
think what we have chosen to do, of course, is use a variety of tools from Surtalp's website. So Surtalp obviously Surtal Bilal on Twitter. His website, FPL Optimized, has a fantastic array of tools that you can actually use to sort of picture your season. So I think it's definitely worth looking at in your own time, but we'll only be choosing a select amount of tools that we thought were quite useful, just as sort of springboards for discussion points. So the first one was actually going to be the transfer quality analysis tool. Now, what I've done obviously is selected the option to show all transfers, so you can see from game weeks 3 to 7, because obviously I rolled on game week 2, what transfers I've done week to week, and what actually ended up being foresight optimal as well, and hindsight optimal. So as you can see, game week 3 was probably one of my big weeks where I went for Sterling and Gusto as a transfer, so that's why both of them show up, and both of them end up being hindsight optimal. It's not, I mean, well, technically Bowen is hindsight optimal, but um, I don't think there was a world where I'd pass up on Sterling getting a lot of points. I think it also shows hindsight optimal simply because Bowen ended up outperforming Sterling
Yeah,
over
yeah.
over
It's
the
very
entire
simple.
run, as opposed to, let's say, outperform Sterling within that singular week.
Oh,
But
no, no, no. So, just for context, it is actually just a singular week. So, I
mhm,
had a chat with Sartal about how the evaluations work.
okay,
And he told me that both for foresight optimal and hindsight optimal, there is no context. So, it's just in a vacuum of that singular game week. And let's say you spend two free transfers, it doesn't even consider like, could you have made two different free transfers and gotten more points out of it?
okay.
Like, for example, pivoting out of someone and then getting someone else in and then captaining them or something like that. Hindsight solves are kind of crazy because outcomes are equally crazy. So it's not that, which is why maybe it's showing Bowen. I don't know if Bowen scored
No,
more
but
points for
I
him,
think it
if I'm
has
being
to show
honest.
the full range though, because Sterling outscored Bowen that week. Sterling was the king of the game week.
Okay, but that's what I heard from Sartal today, so maybe he
Yeah.
can elaborate.
Could be, yeah. But I mean,
Yeah,
I know Sterling for sure got 19 points and Bowen got less.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah, he was a player of the week, so there's no
yeah,
way
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
anyone
So
outscored Sterling. Yeah,
I
fair enough,
I
fair enough,
think
fair
it's
enough.
a useful tool though, just in the sense that I
Yeah,
think Bowen was a reasonable transfer for some managers who are keen to sort of jump onto him, because a lot of us have fond memories of Bowen. But he definitely was not a transfer that was even remotely on my mind. Bowen actually, as
yeah,
it turns out, has something like 0.45 xG per 90, which is pretty
yeah,
mental.
yeah,
And we know his role might be subject to change in the future as well. So we'll see what happens there
yeah.
too. But other transfers, obviously Gusto, nice being there, and then I got lucky once again with Alvarez, really, supplemented by the leaks, the combo league really from Main Road and Luke. And then I think the one transfer I sort of regret from a hindsight point of view is clearly the Udogi one, and I didn't even really need to know that Van de Ven was the foresight optimal transfer, but it was more so the case that I could have actually gone for Trippier that week, but I decided to hold off on Trippier because I was still pretty hung up on Mbumo and thinking that he'd continuously do well nonstop. So I kind of parked that, and I saw that Udogi, for example, at the time had pretty much the same EV as Trippier as long as I adjusted Udogie's minutes, because at the time he was still sort of 70 X min, something like that. Whereas I just thought I could get a little bit more short-term EV, squeeze that in, and it didn't work out. So it is a sort of learning point for me as well. Like maybe if Trippier was actually good on that week anyways, because that week was Brentford at home, which is a reasonably good
Yeah,
week.
yeah,
Sometimes if, let's say, Trippier is going to transfer down the line, why not short circuit that for a week and then maybe do that instead? It also turned out that I actually suddenly had to make even more defender transfers because Chilwell became a problem, which was fairly obvious to me, and why Chilwell became a transfer out to Trippier, which once again is one of my hindsight plus foresight optimal transfers. But Gusto's red card was the icing on the cake, which made Udogie an even worse transfer, just because I was planning to actually play these Chelsea players when Udogie had bad fixtures and then actually bring and just play with Udogie, right, for the meantime. But it ended up being the case that Gusto and Chilwell were both useless to me by the time Game Week 7 and 8 happened. So unfortunately, I had to go Dallo, and I also cashed out of Dallo as well immediately on the wild card. So that's sort of been my sort of transfer quality so far. When I look at the Foresight Optimal, I don't think there's really too much I'm regretful of. I mean, I don't think Van de Ven or Doughty were on my mind. We know, obviously, we talked about how I could have gone Taylor to Morris as well, which would have been probably the more elegant transfer as opposed to, let's say, Gusto to Dallo. But yeah, I think so far I've been very, very lucky with my transfers, and it's nice to see that most of them have ended up being hindsight optimal as well.
yeah. And I think, oh, before we proceed, hi to Peter in the chat and Priyansh or FPL Critic as well. It's basically turning into a skill issues hang, chat hang, with the number of friends we have here. So welcome everyone. And as far as I have skill issues, yeah, I love that. So is that my transfer? Okay, yeah. So for my transfer quality analysis, it's first thing that I love is every single one of those is foresight optimal. So I suppose I don't have to worry a lot about my decision making process. I'm just kidding. Of course, there is something that can be improved always. But I think the key point for you is you didn't get a chance to dead end, right? I think that must be your
Yeah,
only regret
yeah,
because
yeah.
you decided to wildcard suddenly. So if you were to do it all over again, I think that would be probably be the only thing that you would change in terms of. Uh, I don't even know if it's planning out because like the Gusto red card was so sudden that I mean, and the Chilwell injury as well, right? Because I'm sure you had a contingency plan where if he hadn't gotten injured versus Fulham, did he get
Yeah,
injured
I mean,
versus Fulham?
I didn't have to deal with that because I sold Chilwell before
Yeah.
the injury, because I just
Oh,
knew
okay. Huge.
I just knew he was an X-Men's risk as soon as I saw the first
Fair.
benching.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
Which
But
was
it's okay.
foresight optimal.
So yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So for me, I think Watkins to Alvarez turned out to be optimal because Trippier scored so many points, but ultimately
Mm.
Watkins has returned in every single week after I sold him. I think he scored like 9, 23, and 5 in the 3 weeks that I've sold him. But of course, Trippier has also scored 18, 12, and 6. So if anything, Trippier has uh, beaten Watkins by 1 point. So ultimately, my transfers have given me a net positive in terms of points as well. Also in terms of EV, obviously, because 23 points in one game where two of your goals are supposed to be ruled out by VAR is quite mad, if I'm being honest. So I I think that's pretty much. So for example, hindsight optimal. The funniest one I saw was Havertz to Jensen, which is see I love those kind of weird hindsight optimal moves that it shows because there's no way, there's no world where I'm doing that. But I think for a couple of weeks it almost felt like I was chasing points because I transferred in Sterling after his Luton Hall. I transferred in Alvarez after he got 1 goal, 2 assists against Fulham. I think he scored what 14 points in that game. I think so. It kept looking as if I was chasing points, but of course I was chasing EV. And then with the Trippier transfer, it turned around kind of. So Priyan says hindsight optimal is the real grass. Yeah, yeah, fair enough, fair enough. So moving on to what do we have next?
Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, yeah,
All right, so this is
uh,
my sort of point distribution per event type. So actually not so bad, because I think at the end of the episode you'll get to see my little pie chart on X-Men's, and you can probably say that I don't think I don't think I've been that poor in terms of judging X-Men's. I think when I actually look back at my season and obviously look, and this is real men's, right? So this is sort of your outcome minutes. I think I have been pretty hard done by the Gusto red card. Um, because even, for example, like evaluating the EV of someone who doesn't play 60 minutes as a defender just completely tanks and nukes my sort of MD grabbed for that week, even if you look from a Min's perspective. And with Gusto, yeah, I mean, early red card, that was a skill issue. But, you know, that's just pure hindsight. Whereas the foresight skill issue that I really had was with the calling of João Pedro's minutes on game week 3. This was when, before the embargoed press conference, I think it was pretty clear that De Zerbi alluded to the fact that he might be benched because he said Ferguson would start in response to a question about Ferguson and João Pedro. So either you interpret that as De Zerbi missed the point or didn't feel like he needed to say João Pedro started, or you read that as it is almost a matter of fact where it was pretty much intonating a João Pedro bench. Now, what happened actually is that I could have played Saliba ahead of him, which was Saliba versus Fulham. It ended up being the case that Saliba got 1 point, and I believe João Pedro also got 1 point because he was a late sub. But yeah, that was probably the only call this season from a minutes perspective where I struggled. However, yeah, I think Gusto overall is not really a skill issue just because of the red card. I think it is, you know, a justifiable red card, although red cards and yellow cards, they're a bit subjective nowadays, apparently, based on every single Premier League game that I
Yeah,
watch.
no,
But
yeah, yeah.
those being the worst decisions, not really something I'm too worried about.
No, and also I think, and of course, these are intangibles that you really should not worry about, because even if they don't even out, there's no way to capture them. But Liverpool, for example, have been getting the brute end of the stick when it comes to referees for the past few weeks, with players getting sent off that shouldn't have gotten sent off, and ultimately affecting the game state. So you cannot calculate the effect of that, and nor should you try to do that. But at least you should be aware that some of these things, when you look at it in hindsight, are so far beyond your control that you shouldn't even spend any time worrying about it. So as long as you said, like for example, if you discount the Gusto red card, your minutes reading has not been bad. It's been pretty much up to par, or maybe even better than average reading of xPts. Because if you look at that, so the reason we put that up is primarily to gauge our minutes, like how many minutes our players have played.
Yeah,
Because neither of us have played our triple captain, so there is every reason to look at. We can compare minutes basically. So 83.4 minutes per player is not bad, especially given the number of rotations and number of players that have been at risk, that have been fairly popular in FPL this season, including Kai Havertz. So you didn't get to experience that, by the
I
way.
didn't.
I
Yeah,
was on the
I didn't tank his minutes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I experienced that 1 week where he got sub 360, and that was hard to take because Sterling obviously scored 19 points in that week, and it was terrible. So uh, is that mine or is that yours?
I can show yours now. So this
Yeah,
is yours.
yeah. So this is my. So as you can see, I'm pretty much happy with 85 minutes per player that I've gotten as of now, which is the end of 8 weeks. And other than that, hits, of course, both of us have not taken a single hit this season, which I'm pretty happy with. Uh, in a season where COVID is not really a factor and you're playing 10 games every week, and you know where the blanks are and double game weeks are, you would hope to take as few hits as possible. So fairly happy with that as well. Other than that, this is a fairly descriptive table, so not much to conclude from this. I guess the Onana clean sheet in game week 1 was jammy. Wasn't as jammy in against Burnley. I think game week 5, that was pretty. I wouldn't say well deserved, but at least Burnley didn't register a lot of XG compared to Wolves. I think Wolves definitely deserve something out of that game. So uh, I'll take what I can get, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Amdouni obviously had a good chance, and I think they still outscored you in XG, but we did
Yeah,
discuss that on
that's
the
what I'm
episode.
saying. So game
Yeah.
state, if you look at game state, I
Yeah.
still think Burnley deserved something from the
Yeah.
game, but their XG was still pretty low compared
Yeah.
to what Wolves got. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
So this is actually my relative gain team of the year. So once again, obviously, I've toggled the option to show relative gain. And as you can see, it's been pretty poor from the goalkeeping position. Also because I just simply missed out on Pickford's points last week and finally enjoyed my first clean sheet somehow. with Turner. So a position where I think a lot of us put, great thought into it, even coming up with a Pickford Turner pair, considering, for example, Flecken, probably skipping Johnson, to be honest, as well. And even, let's say, avoiding Ederson due to some last minute Sam Lee um, passing by news that he mentioned, where Ortega could obviously maybe take the starting position at various points, or at least that was considered between the City brass. And some other managers, for example, like Priyansh in this chat, actually went for Ederson, and probably it was a very obvious move. At the same time, I think even by the review deadline, I think maybe because of obviously of Ederson minutes adjustments, it came out to be the case that variations of Pickford being the keeper was quite clear, and Pickford has of course performed horrifically. But yeah, I mean, I don't really have too much regrets. A lot of the relative gains in my team um, are owned, I think, within the analytics community, with exception to Gusto and Sterling, because I think I basically have the opposite relationship with Sterling to you. You got Sterling's points after holding him for a long time. I got them immediately, and the same case with Gusto as well. I even, for example, chose to play Gusto versus Bournemouth, which I think was suboptimal slightly on EV, but I just really don't rate Bournemouth as a team. And obviously, that's probably an ongoing small bet that I have with you, where we
Yeah,
have slight disagreements over Bournemouth and Fulham as a team. But all I have to say is I hope Priyansh really enjoys his Bournemouth Football Manager save when they're in the Championship next year.
yeah,
And Trippier and Saliba, yeah, I mean Trippier, I think I also got him probably a week after you did, so probably less relative gain there. And Bumo,
yeah,
just a flavor of the month pick for us really from the start of the game, as soon as his price was revealed, and even the position, which is even worse. When it comes to players like Salah, honestly, I just enjoyed it last week. I haven't enjoyed Salah at all previous in the season, and his ownership is still ridiculously low, which means that I think, yes, whilst a lot of us in the analytics community were sort of battling between, different types of wildcard templates, what we are still and what we should still be able to gain from in the future is Salah effective ownership, right? Just the base ownership itself is going to be very nice, depending on, regardless of the captaincy. And then Saka,
yeah,
unfortunately,
absolutely.
is a very popular pick amongst all circles. So no gains there. Fernandes, obviously, a bit more of an analytics pick, of course. Um, but as it turns out, of course, he's become a much better pick than Rashford simply due to minutes. And I don't think we could have expected this to be so clear cut for Fernandes, who ultimately still has probably failed to deliver, right? Considering that he's very low owned. We've owned him for a long time. He's supposed to be one of the better picks in our team. And over effectively 7 game weeks,
Yeah,
he's delivered nothing for me. However, Julian Alvarez, of course, another star of my season, someone that I was very, very fortunate to own, but also because I went divergent in game week 3, it sort of also forced me into being able to sort of seriously consider him as an option, and I was lucky, as I said, to get the minutes from then, and nice to also cash out before the Arsenal game where he only plays 68 minutes, and then Haaland. As it stands, I think that there should be more effective gain to come because we talked about the 3% of people who have actually dropped him,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah,
just kidding, obviously. And then Estupiñán, Pedro Porro. Not exactly the best so far. Pedro Porro obviously was very close last weekend, but it's sort of a fresh own for me because I did own Udoggy at one point, but it's not like he's been used at all for me. So, and then Pickford, of course, sitting on the bench. Another terrible pick.
yeah. So while you were talking through your team, I also realized that it would be interesting to see relative gains per game,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have a team where it would basically show you like outrageous short-term transfers that you made. Like for example, let's say you transferred Salah in right now, and immediately
Yeah,
you got 20.1 points,
exactly. That's crazy.
which is kind of nuts because if you compare that to the rest of your team, they have some of them haven't even managed to give you that in 8 weeks.
Yep.
Of course, because they are highly owned, but also because some of them haven't delivered as many points in bulk. So that would also be interesting to see. I'm going to try to see if I can get Sattar to add that as a feature because it's just a fun thing. I don't think you can conclude anything based on that because obviously that anything that would show where you got lucky, I would say.
Right. So
If
something
you
like
were
relative
to,
gain per game week, almost like
yeah,
per
like
game weeks owned, I suppose. Yeah.
exactly, per how many games you played them, and then that average would be how you show the top 11 players in your team.
Yeah.
And so for goalkeepers, I suppose it would be the same because I mean, how many goalkeepers are you going to own in a season, right?
Yeah.
So it's not going to be that bad. But I am suspecting that, for example, Pedro Porro, I'm going to sell after Gameweek 9, might end up in that situation in my team because I would only be owning him for 2 weeks
Hmm.
because his relative gains would be short or smaller compared to a season, but over 2 weeks they might be one of the best.
Yeah.
So it's just something to
So you have no interest in holding him, is it just because he's a placeholder for an Arsenal defender?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the plan right now. Obviously, things can change between now and Game Week 10, but
Yeah.
looks like that now.
The only thing that I'd say was quite interesting is that once I upped his minutes, and I think it's fair to up his minutes, he actually became
Yeah.
less of a transfer out in terms of my sort of optimal review lines. So I right now my plan is actually to keep him, but obviously these things can change as you said.
No, but I think also you don't want to now spend free transfers on him, right? For
Yeah,
me, it's just one final chance to see if I can get better value in that
that's
place.
true. Yeah,
So let's say I have somewhere else where I need zero point 0.2, zero point 0.3 million, then I would downgrade Poro to someone like Gabriel. Or if I need zero point 0.1, I go to Zinchenko, something like that. I haven't fixated on anything yet, but as of now, I think those are my two options if I were to downgrade.
makes sense. Let's have a look at your team then.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the biggest difference is Onana, who has been a big differential for my team, and Peter says that he got 23.8 relative gain from Ederson. Although I still will continue to mock people that owned Ederson just because of his price tag and the number of clean sheets they ended up losing.
Yeah,
So that's still kind of funny, even though I know they kept some clean sheets and people got a lot of points out of that. The clean sheets that they lose is always much more funny. Um, anyway, coming back to this, I think Saliba obviously has been the star of my team. 28.1 points is the highest in my team, and he's delivered every time I've needed him as an auto sub. Admittedly, I've done the benching stuff where I played Botman. Obviously, Botman was not going to play, and he was my auto sub. But uh, I still love doing that and getting him off the bench. And the clean sheet against Man City was wholly unexpected. So that's obviously I love that. And also Trippier is I think similar as yours. Did we get him in the same week? I think we did, right?
yeah, we might have now that I'm actually sort of reflecting on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, because we got his 18 points. I think the only difference that week was I also had Botman,
yeah, you did have Botman. Yeah,
the second Newcastle defender. So obviously Botman is also in there because I have him from Game Week 1, and it was one of those transfers where I was not trying to be too cute, but at the same time I was trying to anticipate a transfer down the line and trying to bring that to the front. And maybe that has forced me into wildcarding in a sense because let's say if I had gone with someone like Udogi, I would not have used a free transfer on Pedro Porro, and maybe I would have been in a position where I could have pivoted to Salah much more easily and then kept my wildcard for the future. So small decisions like that sometimes build up to one major decision, which could be the case in this, but you never know how it could have panned out if I had started somewhere else. Um, Other than that, I think the biggest flag for my team is I have captain Son twice and he's blank twice. So going against Holland hasn't punished me too badly, except for the XG rank that I lost when he should have absolutely hauled against West Ham with 2.6 XG or whatever he got in that game.
I think 3 point
And
something.
no way,
Was it
no,
not?
I don't think it was more than
Might
three.
not have been.
More than
Yeah.
three would be just uh, just a punishment, I think, at that point. Uh, and other than that, obviously Sterling last week came in quits finally before I sell him this week. And Watkins is a very weird one because I've owned him when no one else pretty much owned him, and now that everyone owns him, I don't own him anymore. So good to get some points from him when he was winning penalties and not taking them. And I saw a quote today that apparently he has been practicing on them, and he said, "You never know when I would be back on them." So if he were to get back on penalties before I own him, that would be a travesty indeed. So I hope that doesn't happen. But yeah, that's pretty much it for my relative gains.
I've actually got a curious question because I think you mentioned that your wild card might be fast forwarded because of some of the transfers that you made and obviously some of the outcomes, like for example Botman being injured and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
are you still, for example, getting that line where you're asked to go, let's say, out of Holland, and then spend two free transfers to go Watkins and Salah instead, or is that no longer your top line if you
Yeah.
choose to
So
go wildcardless?
that's actually a great question, and I've honestly done this evaluation every single week as I've
Mm-hmm.
come closer to Game Week 10, where I'm evaluating two lines. One line is wildcard Game Week 10, wildcard. One line is don't wildcard.
Yeah.
And for no wildcard up and until last week, it was showing me exactly what you said, which was going out of Holland to Watkins and going out of someone like Bruno Fernandes or even Mboemo, I think, because I also had cash in the bank
Yeah.
to directly go to someone like Salah. But now it's not suggesting me do that anymore. So, for
Wow.
example,
Okay.
Salah in is a move which is slated for Game Week 14. 14 is just too far away. I
Yeah,
mean, I
and part of
can't
that is
look
spurred
at
on simply because of the blank. That's it, I think.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes. Uh, and I should note that Game Week 20, the provision to enter fixture probability is still not in yet on the review.
Yes. Yeah, it's not.
So if someone is trying to look that far ahead, I don't think it's going to work right now. I don't think it's going to work anyway because it's so far ahead right now that you have to go through one more international break before you actually get to Game Week 20, I think. And then there's a whole stack of fixtures that are going to pile up. So that made actually cemented my decision for me because if there were two lines that are fairly close, one with wildcard, one without wildcard, I would tend to go with the one without wildcard. But now they are not close. I think the EV gap is, if I use a decay of 1.0, I think the EV gap is uh, 12 or 13. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I expect it to grow once I adjust minutes properly because I still think there are some players, for example, Matt Turner, who is still on 70 X minutes, which I understand from a review perspective because you always have to factor in the uncertainty of someone like Vlachodimos taking his place. But when I'm solving with an assumption that he is certain to start because Ariola is always there to cover for him if he loses his place. So that kind of helps me out in terms of adjusting expense of those players. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that's so interesting because obviously this time last week, I think, and what's even more interesting is actually this time last week, I think the solves were still very pro Salah, but it's one of those classic, examples that solves are always point in time analyses. And,
Yeah,
and, and
yeah, yeah,
by
yeah.
the time the deadline came last week, it was very clear that Holland plus Salah was optimal for me. And when I was sort of running some wild cards this week, I was still seeing Holland plus Salah, but on Game Week 10 wild cards that I'm sort of solving for now, I'm actually not seeing as much of Salah, which is something that's worth considering, I would say.
Yeah, so Priyan's in the chat is saying Strakosha 3.7 starter for Brentford in game week 20. I don't think that's going to be the case because I think Flecken is going to be back
Yeah, I
by
mean,
that
so
point.
he's also a little bit rich to assume that he could drop twice more in price.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah, I don't think FPL will allow that because that just breaks the game. I know they've made certain decisions, for example, pricing Mbuemo the way they did, which already kind of broke the game before it even started. But I think if you allow a goalkeeper to fall to a price like 3.7, it is going to get utterly ridiculous. Because if you see, as soon as Ariola became a starter, they didn't wait for people to transfer him in. They just started upping his price to 4.1, 4.2. And I'm pretty sure he's going to go up again if
yeah,
he keeps
and
starting
he
as
should
people
he
keep
should
transferring.
because
He
there are
should, he should.
4.5 keepers who are horrible, you know,
Yeah.
and Areola's, and that's why I also wanted to go Areola Turner simply because I knew Raya was game breaking, but if you actually, for example, up Areola's minutes, which are also, for example, a little bit nerfed because there's still a sliver of a probability that I think review puts in for Fabianski to come back into the team. Both of them are very, very good picks if you just look at a very simple sort of test, which I do with specifically defenders and goalkeepers, which is just to look at their PPM once you've adjusted their minutes.
Yeah, and
So
I think one more thing that we have discussed offline, which I think is very pertinent here, which is for goalkeepers, I don't trust modeling their EV to the
mm,
extent to which I trust for midfielders, forwards, and defenders.
yeah,
Because I feel like, for example, if you can squeeze value out of goalkeepers the way you are doing with Turner and Ariola, who are now, I think, combined 8.3 million, it's insane value. Where, as for example, if you can upgrade even one defender because of this combination over someone like David Raya, I think it is definitely worth it. As long as you know that one of those will keep starting. Because if both of them are uncertain, then that kind of nerves their effectiveness. in case both of them are out of favor at the same time. But I think Ariola is pretty much the starting goalkeeper now, and I don't think there is a chance of being replaced, because if you look at Fabianski's age profile, I mean, he's now going to be clearly the second goalkeeper, because his age profile is somewhat akin to Ben Foster. If you look at Ben Foster's career towards the end, he was definitely playing second fiddle to Daniel Bachmann, right, at Watford.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the logic of, for example, trying to spend as much money in the outfield if you have more confidence in, for example, the EV of outfielders makes sense too. But I do think Raya is generally game breaking, and I think all of us
He
within
is. He
that,
is.
and you could obviously see. I mean, I immediately
Yeah.
posted I wanted to go Raya Areola.
Yeah.
Half also assuming that I think I might have actually dipped into Haalandless as well, because that way you feel like you just want to win on all fronts, right? Because
Yeah.
you're sort of taking a free risk on all fronts.
Yeah.
And yeah,
So
so
I'm curious to know one thing out of this. So if you had gone, let's say, Ariola Raya instead of Ariola Turner,
yeah.
what would have been the sacrifice in your team? Do you remember what was the change or
Um,
multiple changes?
so the sacrifice would be I definitely couldn't squeeze Trippier into my team. Uh,
Hmm.
but obviously I was always on a Madison draft. So really the sacrifice was actually Watkins versus Alvarez.
Okay.
Yeah, so actually I decided, for example, to spend a little bit more money on Watkins just because I'm more confident about the fixtures and the minutes ultimately. And it's a safer play from that position to always go down, I think, from Watkins, because Alvarez is always a future suggested transfer, but it's not like, I mean, those fixtures won't change. They're still bad for City objectively. So I just thought, yeah, I'm just go Watkins short term. And I don't really mind even squeezing Richarlison, which is basically another sort of punt that I went for. Because I knew Madison, for example, on every single solve was always going to be a transfer out. Even if, for example, I maxed out his minutes, like he was always just going to be a suggested transfer. So I thought I might just go actually Trippier over Dallo, who I had less confidence in, and really the EV differences between, let's say, the combination of Dallo plus Richarlison versus Madison and Dallo plus Madison versus Richarlison and Trippier weren't too different. And ultimately, there was some upside to be gained with Richarlison playing more minutes, although, of course, as it turns out, he only played 45 due to another red
Yeah,
card.
and also, of course, no one can hold the halftime sub against you because of the game state. But also at the same time, I had mentioned my reservations to you about Richarlison even beforehand.
Yeah,
Not maybe not effusively, but I think I had, because my only concern with Richarlison always is that he is not indispensable. I think he's the first one that they will dispense of
yeah,
to change formation, change setup, whatever Ange wants to do. So only from that point of view, I was always worried. But of course, I never expected that to materialize so horribly for you. So I'm not going to sit here and say that that was a deserved outcome. Of course, it was not deserved, but that does become a problem for you after game week 9 anyway, right? Because
yeah. But
after game
as I
week
said, he's
9,
a 2 week punt, though, right? Because
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So if I had, let's say, if I had to make a similar fund, I think for me, going Richarlison would have made even more sense, because I had a wild card to play.
yeah,
So if I had gone Richarlison, I always knew I was going to get rid of him anyway, without spending any free transfers.
hmm.
And for you as well, it's not going to be that bad, because that spot I think is reserved for an Arsenal midfielder anyway.
Yeah, it has
So
to
it
be.
doesn't matter exactly. So it doesn't matter who is being replaced in a sense. It's just who are you replacing that spot with. And as long as it's Saka or Odegaard or both, if you make two midfielder transfers, I think it's still going to be pretty much positive, and hopefully outcome points positive as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice in the sense that, for example, now I have some sort of optionality between switching between either Son or Trippier, because you can argue both of them have worse fixtures, but not so bad where you can say you can't keep Son after 10 or you can't keep Trippier after 10. And now with, for example, Robertson being out, I don't even think there's really a place where you want to spend that sort of money in the defensive position outside of Trippier. And a lot of us still own, for example, Trippier at like a 6.5, 6.6, that sort of price point. So he still feels like a very cost efficient defender for the time being. But I can
Yeah.
understand people selling, either Trippier or Son on 10. And that's just the reality of our draft situations and structures. Like, you have to afford a little bit more money to get these Arsenal picks. And let's say if Saka feels like he's someone who's a little bit of a doubt for Game Week 10, you've always got Odegaard because that just gives you more pen share if Saka's out
Mm,
at any point in
mm,
time. So a lot of considerations to be made, but really all the transfers are sort of aimed towards Arsenal. And then I think, as I see with some of my solves, the next best opportunity to bring in Arsenal players is, for example, Game Week 14, if you don't already have a triple up by 10. And that's the same case with, for example, going for other picks like Palmer or even Mbumo if you've decided to take him out of your team. So I think a lot of us, for example, even in the chat here, have sort of made the call to go Diaby, which I think is obviously very much so against review, but probably
mm.
maybe a bit more supported by other models and just in general, I guess, people who don't necessarily vibe with Brentford for the time being. And yeah, there's also decisions as well that some other people made. For example, myself, where I went for Gordon. Some others went for Neto, Palmer, these sorts of picks. So I think you're seeing a little bit more diversity, even in with the Salah Haaland drops, just because people have taken different stances on that sort of budget midfield slot. Although, as it turns out, obviously, Mbumo and Gibbs White, those two picks have beautiful fixtures in Game Week 9. So that's going to be a little bit source of concern and FOMO for me for those two picks.
Mm.
But ultimately, Mbumo with another price fall in the future, even for example Saka getting a price fall potentially as well, and Botman, that's going to really help a lot of the people who wildcarded out of those picks but might actually want to bring them back in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. If speaking of uh, Morgan Gibbs White playing Luton, we've actually looked at the FreeHit 9
Yeah.
draft and what reviews suggests right now based
Do you want to have
on
a look at it now?
default,
Yeah, let's do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
default minutes, and it's just something because we found a number of people sort of suggesting that FreeHit 9 could be a real possibility, which I find uh, preposterous because I think most of us own majority of these assets anyway, even without a free hit, even without free transfers, I think,
Yeah.
for the majority of them, especially if you've just wildcarded. So it just makes no sense. But for anyone listening on podcast, it's Strakosha Turner in goal. It's Niakate, Share, Burn, Taylor, Trippier. So triple Newcastle defense. In midfield, it's Salah, Son, Mbeumo, Fernandes, Morgan Gibbs White. And the forwards are Holland, Mobama, and Alvarez. So if you look at this, I think for my team, it's like 7 or 8 players in my team already. So for you, I think it must be something similar, but could be slightly lower because you just wildcarded out of Momo and Fernandes.
Yeah, it's actually just 5 for
So
me. Just 5.
yeah, 5. Yeah, but the alternatives are not half bad either. So if you look at someone
Exactly.
like
I mean, everyone has a home
Alvarez,
fixture this week. You must have
exactly,
at least
exactly,
13 players in your team with home fixtures. That's just
yes,
how
yes,
these fixtures have unfolded.
yeah, yeah. So essentially, this was just to separate it out from our next week's podcast, where we are going to obviously talk about Gaming 9. But I don't think this is a serious consideration for
Yeah.
anyone who has planned their transfers carefully, because whether you are dead ending in Game 10, whether you just wildcard in Game 8, or whether you want to wildcard in Game 19, for all these three scenarios, you are pretty much well covered for this weekend.
Mo says Simicast might interest you.
Yes, and I had this conversation with Fran as well before we heard about Robertson breaking his arm or potentially getting a serious injury, which was that I've seen a lot of Liverpool fans complaining about Robertson's defending in general and him being responsible for a majority of the goals they concede. Now I know that the drop off from Robertson to Simicas is still quite a bit in terms of quality and reliability, but um, in previous seasons we've seen due to workload management, Simicas has been given games. Whereas here, there's not a case of workload management because Liverpool are not in the Champions League. So in Europa, they don't need to be as serious with their lineups. So I don't know what's going to happen. But now that Robertson is injured, there is definitely a consideration for someone like Simikas. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, 100%. I think you've got to just consider what the timeline is for Robertson being out because Simicast actually might even interest me as someone with a free transfer, right? Because the EV must be ludicrously good. The
Yeah,
issue, of course,
yeah.
is that we've brought in players like Cash, Dallo, Trippier. All these sorts of players will already have really, really good EV, and
Hmm.
maybe you don't really want to dip into the Liverpool defense, unless you, for example, think Simicast is also going to be maybe as attacking as Robertson has been, because you can still see Robertson actually bombarded a lot in open play this year, which is a nice sort of role change from the sort of position he was almost playing in when Trent was sort of playing
Left center back.
hybrid
Yeah, left
midfield.
center
So
back.
that
Yeah.
has changed a little bit too, and I think also that's washed away some of the criticisms of Robertson's defending too, because he's sort of playing a little bit more of a freer role and has less defensive duties assigned to him. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic. We definitely have to stay tuned to that. But going back to the point about, how this team is so close to you as a non-wildcard and me as a wildcarder, I think it just sort of speaks to why a lot of people sort of preferred 8 and 10, and why,
Hmm. Hmm.
even though it makes sense for a lot of people who might be doing it on 9, because, for example, Mez, who appeared on this chat earlier, she has been dealing with a lot of injuries in her team, and it was sort of a natural point to maybe switch into a Liverpool heavy sort of team this week, right? Because if you have, let's say, the
Hmm.
confidence in Liverpool, the minutes of certain players, this is a very nice start point to jump onto Liverpool. Because even if we look back at last week, with the exception to Salah, it's not like it was an amazing week for Liverpool assets. But a home fixture, obviously, here is very, very different. You're expecting, for example, a clean sheet too, whereas versus Brighton, you're not. So I think it's just interesting that a lot of us already spotted 8 and 10 as opportunities, and this sort of backs it up as well, as it turns out. And another thing I would say is I do think international breaks are totally overrated, because yeah, we're, as Priyansh says, one of the downsides of wildcard is we're sat here and we're terribly bored. But we could be spending
No,
some
and
time
you know what?
drafting
It's
a
so
wild card.
funny. It's
But
so
yeah,
funny. People always correlate the number of days you have between 2 weeks
yeah,
as correlating that to how many price rises you can catch. But it's almost always never the case, because if you look at the previous 2 days, yesterday Trippier was the
dry. Yeah,
only one that went up in price. No price falls, I think.
no price
And the day
falls.
before it was Eze and one more player. I think there were only two players who went down in price and
Yeah,
no price rises. It is as barren as it can get, the landscape of price rises and price falls. So if your sole reason to wildcard is international break and being able to catch more price rises, that's never the case. It almost feels like they try to keep this area under the curve the same. So basically, if it you have 14 days instead of 7, they just spread them out instead
yeah,
of bunching them. Like for example, the week before wildcard 8 was, I think, the most insane week I've seen in terms of price rises and falls,
yeah.
because you can attest to that. Your team value must have changed by more than 1 million for sure, for
It
sure.
did, but obviously because I invested into a lot of picks that I didn't have sort of value over previously, my
Yeah,
transfer value has dropped. But we know obviously there's a difference between team value and sell value. So
yeah, of course,
my
of
sell
course.
value
Yeah,
obviously has increased a lot. But I also made the decision to go out of Madison, so technically I've sort of robbed myself of a little bit of sell value there. And as I told you, I actually kept
yeah, yeah.
Madison over Trippier, sold Trippier, then bought Trippier back. But I don't have major regrets over that, substantially. So it's
And
fine.
did you you bought Trippier back for 6.8, right?
Yeah,
So
for 6.8,
six
and
point
and
nine
and he's
already, and
and
he's going
he's
to be
risen.
7 now.
Exactly. And some people actually dropped him off, right, on a Salah Holland wild card. But you just can't hold them all. I kind of said this on a post on Twitter, where it's just like, once you own Salah Holland, you can't afford them all. Like Madison and Trippier
No.
is not something that's negotiable if you also want to own Son. So at that point you'd probably have to drop Son. But
Yeah.
it's a little bit nicer owning Son, because worst case scenario, he's a placeholder for Saka, as opposed to owning Madison and then actually needing to also save 0.7 to go Madison to Saka, which obviously is a very elegant one free transfer situation. But you
Yeah.
want Son as a fallback option, just in case, for example, you want to do something even nicer, which would be Saka and Odegaard for the two of them as a pair. And yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about the free hit is obviously just going to be the minutes on Alvarez, because he is the one sort of South American player here, where you're looking at maybe his minutes being managed potentially. We've seen it
Yeah.
already, a benching in Rebel Leipzig, being an early sub, just because I think Lewis, creeping into those pockets now actually sort of maybe could hurt Alvarez minutes wise at times. And yeah, that could be an interesting little change option, because of course at 7.0 versus Brighton at home, if you give him good minutes, he's going to be nailed in the draft. But if you exclude him, then it's actually going to be a lot harder to recreate this, for example, free hit team. So one thing to consider as well, when you're thinking about
Hmm.
best picks for
Hmm.
Gameweek 9.
So that's an interesting point actually. So for I'm assuming that if you, let's say, exclude Alvarez, or if you reduce his minutes enough so that his EV drops, I suspect that
Solanke.
the new free draft that you get, Solanke, yes. Solanke could be the one. Or the other option is it pivots to Watkins and turns even more into a game week 8 wildcard draft,
Yeah.
which makes sense, because that's exactly how majority of the wildcard game week 8 wildcarders are set up. what they've done is they've made room for Watkins by some of them by selling Alvarez, some of them by just going from maybe someone like Morris
Yep.
to someone like Watkins, and in that process taking out money from some other position. So it absolutely makes sense. But I think as soon as you said Solanke, I thought to myself, yes, yeah, that he will be there. I think. Yeah.
All right, so the last one we have to look at is really just you fortunately managed to take screen grabs of our team when the season review feature was still live on FPL Review.
Yeah.
So I've got my pie chart first. What are the
Yeah.
most interesting pie charts that I've seen so far? So interestingly, I've grabbed a lot of MD, which is now based on post minutes. So it's nice to see that my X-Men security is absolutely toilet. So a case to make as well, I think Review mentioned on Twitter that I think a little bit less focus has been put onto getting the default X-Men's, up to standard this season. I believe he's actually
Yeah.
already outrightly said that. So it makes sense that my X-Men security is that low because I'm also someone who always adjusts mins nonstop.
Yeah.
And as I said,
I can
I
testify.
have
I can
made
testify.
mistakes with, for example, João Pedro, so to speak. But beyond that, I think I've been, as we saw even with the FPL optimized sort of point distribution chart, that my minutes have been okay so far, as it turns out. So that's correlated, fortunately, into some nice MDEV. But there are things to work on as well, and we're probably also expecting to get XG data shortly at one point this season, and maybe we can sort of reflect on that when that comes out. But yeah, something that I'm also clearly lacking in is outcome variability. Although I'm certainly not lacking in luck for the time being. Although I think things have changed since Gameweek 5 because I actually had 2 red arrows after that and then 1 green. So maybe the luck would have dropped a touch as well. But yeah, outcome variability is something that might be tied down to the fact that I own triple Chelsea, all triple Chelsea assets, requiring clean sheets as well. I owned Arsenal assets as well, maybe an additional one on top of a lot of people because I owned Havertz and Saka to start the season with,
Hmm.
and also Saliba, so another triple up there. Plus, I also owned Bruno Rashford until quite recently, so I have been sort of, in a sense, hedging with certain teams, top teams. Maybe United not so much right now, but that has been the case in my season, and I think it's also partly because maybe I rejected Spurs. Um, out of just wanting to see how they would actually look like as a team, which I think a lot of analytics managers sort of took that approach too. We sort of cautiously invested into Spurs as opposed to when you, for example, look at, let's say, the analytics elite charts that sometimes show the ownership of players versus the
Hmm.
traditional elite. I think a lot of people started the season off with someone like a Madison, maybe not a defender per se, but obviously we're happy to jump on to a defender quite quickly as well, including Son, which were all picks, for example, that I've rejected myself. I even own, for example, double forwards within the City position, and I have owned them
Yeah.
for quite a while, up until last week where I owned Haaland and Alvarez. So that's probably why outcome variability has been low. But I also think sometimes it's just been the nature of the season. You start off, you see the fixture run, you own certain assets. So I think as the season will develop, that outcome variability will inevitably change, and I'm sure it will, given the fact that I've wildcarded to a substantially different team. But that's all I have to
Well,
say, really.
and one thing to talk about outcome variability is I don't think there is anything to target within that. I think
Yeah,
that's just a consequence of your decision making and how your team is. So obviously we always focus on EV, and I think both of us focus on minutes as well. I don't think everyone focuses on minutes as much as they do,
yeah,
as much as we do. But I certainly think there is an emphasis on EV for everyone who plays analytically. And one thing that was actually extremely unfortunate was the fifth midfield position for most of the people in analytics has gone so badly in terms of both of us starting with Havertz, others starting with Richarlison, and not getting anything for till, for example, you transferred Havertz out to Sterling in game week 3, and for me that luck continued till last week.
yeah.
So game week 8 was the first week where I got a return from that midfield position in my team. And I think for even for you, right, game week 3 was the only game week where you got a return in that position till you wild card.
Exactly, yeah. And obviously
Yeah.
that
So
competing position is versus Matoma, right? A very popular pick.
or even Madison, because Madison has
Yep.
gotten
Yep.
points in multiple game weeks in pockets. It's not like he's just delivered in 1 or 2 weeks. So those points. And Mitoma, I think Mitoma is the worst case where he got subbed down and then scored 2 and got 3 bonus points in that game. So that was a nightmare in Game Week 6, I think. So in that sense, absolutely, we will take we will take the EV, but at the same time, if some of the other picks had stayed quiet, it would have gone much better.
Yeah, yeah. And let's actually have a look at your pie chart then.
Yeah, so as Fran pointed out, this is at the end of Game Week 5, September 26th, 2023, when review decided that the season review tool needs to go on a diet, and it's still on a diet. So it's going to need some of that keto thing, or maybe some Ozempic to get rid of all that excess fat. Anyway, so if we look at this pie chart, I don't know how I have so much outcome variability, by the way. And I need to ask review exactly how I've managed to achieve this much outcome variability, because I'm trying to think of, I have thought of certain scenarios which have contributed to that, but I am not exactly sure why that has happened. I think similar to you, the points chart is obviously much higher than the EV chart. But my X-min security is good. But as you pointed out, I am pretty sure as soon as I saw the word X-min instead of minutes, I am pretty sure that they are still using X-min. And because review said that it's either maintaining X minutes or maintaining the site, or basically closing it down. Those were his two options. So keep maintaining, drop the maintenance of X minutes or close down the site. So if it is that extreme a choice, obviously you go with dropping the close scrutiny that was being put on X minutes. So I just think that's something that we can ignore for now, unless
Yeah.
they change it to minutes. Because I'm only interested now in seeing how the minutes turn out. And we've already seen that in the point distribution graph, where Fran has around 83 minutes per player on average, and I have 85. So we already have a sense of how good of minutes peak each of our player has been. And other than that, I mean, obviously, I want to shoot for more EV. I think a couple of people who were in the chat today have definitely higher EV than the two of us, and we can go for more EV centric approach. But at the same time, I think something like your Gusto red card, or for me, the Kai Havertz substitution 360 are events that are beyond your control. And because EV is based on minutes, as soon as that thing happens, your EV is tanked. And there's no way to recover in that. It's not as if you've banged that EV, and because that's what used to happen, right? In previous seasons, let's say someone got benched all of a sudden. The first thing that people used to discuss in analytics group chats is, I've banked the EV already, which is obviously a kind of a reassuring thing, right? Because that thing was not in their control. But at the same time, I'm on the side where I prefer minutes. Even though they introduce some noise into EV, I still prefer them, because I want to be rewarded more for my reading of minutes, more than I want to be punished for, let's say, getting one reading wrong, or getting an event in the game which led to me getting those X-Mins wrong. I would much rather prefer that than just depend on X-Mins which are done by a hive mind that might not know something that I know. So I definitely believe in using minutes instead of X-Mins. And also the admin work is supposed to be simplified a lot. So if that is the case, then I'm all for it. If it is not at the cost of significant accuracy, and I think you're the same, right?
Yeah, because I was actually thinking about it again too. Because let's say you're looking at default, X-Men's EV. It's very hard to sort of see where you might have gone wrong. Whereas now, for example, even though I might not have grabbed the full amount of MD that I wanted, I kind of know directionally where sort of the issues have been. For example, Alvarez playing less minutes than we would have expected in the Nottingham Forest fixture, the Gusto
Yeah.
red card, things like that. It's so much easier to identify, like looking back, like what could have lost my MD. Whereas last season, I think because we're looking at default X-Men, and for example, you saw the difference and the disparity between our charts. Me going with maybe I would say picks that required a little bit more expense adjustments to get to. It's so hard to see whether you're even applying that sort of skill correctly. Whereas now, for example, because I know my MD is quite strong, I can look back and just say, okay, to be honest, I've just been hit by outcome in certain circumstances, as opposed to I have a terrible read of minutes so far, and that's ruining my MD. I now know, for example, where my MD might be lacking in. a little bit better is sort of the way I'm seeing it. But
Yeah, no,
we all recognize that hidden barriers ourselves because we can review on our seasons, look at our moves, and say, I was unlucky here. But yeah,
that is an interesting point, because the other side of that sort of outlook is your variance, right?
yeah,
For example, till last season, when you looked at variance, it was purely a collection of every single thing that went better than you expected, or
hmm,
worse than you expected,
yeah,
or worse than the review expected. But now what has happened is, because it's based on your EV is based on minutes, all of these events that are happening because of injuries, uh, game state changes, they will never be captured as a part of variance.
exactly.
And you have to sort of factor that into your EV when you compare and contrast with other people, or let's say top managers that we rate, because it's no longer a case of, oh, I've just been unlucky by looking at the pie chart. Your luck is now sort of divided across both EV and variance, because some of that luck is now indelibly a part of EV.
Yeah,
Which again, as I said, I'm in favor of that, because I want to be, my desire to be rewarded is more than my willingness to suffer punishment, I guess. Like, I would suffer, I'm okay with getting hit by, as you pointed out, the Alvarez substitution, or as I pointed out, the Havertz substitution, which I was quite angry about. But at the same time, I thought, okay, when I look back at the season's review, as you pointed out, I can just consider those factors. And of course, they are not going to be tangible factors. Like, I can't quantify them, but at the same time, I can say, okay, if these events had not occurred, maybe we are looking at something different. But at the same time, you don't know what hasn't occurred with your team. So, for example, if there are events that have occurred outside your team, you might not remember them. So it's slightly tricky. And
yeah.
I get the argument for using X-Mins, but I was always feeling that the X-Mins did not accurately reflect reality in many situations. And so that is, I think, the main reason why I and you as well are in favor of using real names.
Yeah, the best example, sorry, the best example that I can give is like Chilwell's second benching, right?
Yeah.
Versus Aston Villa. So I think by the first benching, it was very clear once again, and it kind of reminds me of my own issue where I didn't listen to Zerbi in the first press conference where it was kind of clear that João Pedro might be benched. I don't think Pochettino gave any sort of clue at all that Chilwell deserved to be still within the starting 11. And so a lot of people
Mm,
misread what the commentators said, which was that Chilwell had a knock or that he was ill,
mm,
whereas Pochettino didn't make any sort of reference to that. And I think such a good compare and contrast is when Sterling, for example, was awkwardly benched due to being ill in game week 7, it was very clear that he wasn't in training for 3 days. Pochettino spoke about it, spoke about why he wasn't in the team, and
mm,
subsequently
mm,
he plays and starts the next game. Whereas with Chilwell, sitting on the bench versus Bournemouth, and also very clear when you listen back to the press conference that I think people overread the quotes on Mudryk and also underread actually the quotes about fullbacks, which obviously Chilwell was a part of the problem with, right, within that certain game. So I think that it's probably more helpful actually now that we don't have default minutes because usually what happens with minutes is the default minutes in previous seasons, they don't get adjusted until you see, for example, a subsequent bench because you don't know how to react to the first one. But sometimes you do get enough insight from a manager, in my opinion, to sort of make that gut call. And if you're wrong, obviously you can kind of adjust for that. But sometimes I do think there are signs there, and being rewarded for that feels quite nice, in my opinion, as someone who went Chilwell to Trippier on the week that Chilwell was benched the second time because I was able to react to stimulus in a sense, and I kind of got a good outcome from a Min's perspective, moving Chilwell on to Trippier. Not just, of course, the pure luck that was 3 assists from Trippier. But that's all I have to
Yeah, and
say on that.
also for Game Week 6, I think we also talked about that on the podcast. I think the Game Week 5 preview,
Yeah,
where we discussed the exact quote by Pochettino, where he said that he's playing too far ahead and it's confusing the wingers. And
yeah,
when a manager says something like that, I'm taking that at face value, because as you know, okay, yeah. So Peter is saying take a shot every time. Fran reminds us he got Chilwell's X move right. Yeah, absolutely. And okay, I'm going to also gloat, because I also sold in that same week and we did exact same transfer.
yeah.
So I'm also going to gloat about
Just a
that.
big
But I
podcast
think,
debut.
Absolutely. And also, I think the bigger point for me to gloat about is what you mentioned, which I had completely forgotten, which was Sterling starting against Burnley.
Yeah.
Because I spoke to so many Chelsea fans, and shout out to FPL Jack, who was the only one, and StatsRan. They were the only two predictors in Hivemind who told me that they don't foresee Sterling being benched.
Yeah.
And I was so sure that Sterling won't be benched because he is actually their best attacker. There is no doubt about that. I mean, Cole Palmer, but he's quite young, so I'm only considering established players. So out
Yeah.
of all
In
the
fact,
established
I'll
players,
jump in actually just say on
yeah,
the jump the wave prediction, Sterling only was predicted to start by
exactly,
less than
50, like
50% of predictors, which is
exactly,
once again an indication that I think that there's a lot of work still to be done, and sometimes
yeah,
obviously look 38 game weeks of decision making on minutes will probably average out to showing whether you've shown
fair enough,
aptitude for
fair enough,
getting minutes
fair
right
enough.
or not. Because
Yes,
I think if we asked everyone on this show, chat, including us, whether Gabriel started in game week 2, we would probably all would have said yes, and he didn't.
yeah,
And
yeah,
sometimes you
yeah.
get these things wrong, but better to get
No, but
things right
also
most often.
the domino effect was so crazy that every single week, one Arsenal player kept getting injured till Arteta had only 4 players left to play in defense. I mean, it almost got to that point. So those events are completely out of your control. But just to end on the Sterling point, some of the Chelsea fans also got into like heated debates with me on WhatsApp group chats and stuff, and
Hmm.
I didn't want to like entertain that because I was so convinced whatever they said didn't matter to me. Like all of their points were centered around, oh, but Mudrik just scored a goal.
Hmm.
So what? I mean,
Just take a screenshot of
Sterling is.
Sterling's points. That's it.
I mean, I'm not the
Hold.
one who gloats after points, but because I think the
Okay.
points speak for themselves, just like
Okay.
Hans Niemann said.
That's you.
So, but
Uh,
yeah, I mean, I think both of us are in good moods because first of all, the Green Arrow, and I think we've had a pretty good start our game week. And just to boast even more, I think our podcast is the best performing podcast out there right now, an average rank of 90K.
yeah, and
So
yet our
just saying,
podcast
just
chat
saying.
is all outperforming us. I believe Priyansh,
Yes,
Mo, and
yes,
Peter all have
yes.
better actual points than us as well.
Actual points,
So
absolutely, and probably better MD than us as well. So yeah, yeah, that's where the skill issue comes from.
yeah. Well, I think that was actually a pretty enjoyable episode. Obviously, just a little bit of a break episode.
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
much discussion really about the meta of FPL, but I think it's also nice to just look back at the decisions we've made so far, reflect on them. In terms of game week 9, any sort of preliminary thoughts you have before we do next week's preview episode?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, just to reiterate, we will be coming back for next week
Yeah,
before Game Week 9. So this is not a Game Week 9 preview.
yeah, certainly
As
not.
Fran said, yeah, as Fran said, I think it was just good to kick back and have a relaxed episode for a change where we are not worried about misspeaking and then the re-recording and then just spending more and more time on the recording, just getting it out there, and also testing out how our stream is going to move forward in terms of having it at maybe every international break or whenever we feel like there's a large gap between game weeks. We can definitely keep on streaming like we have this week. But for Game Week 9, I think making no transfers if possible and keeping a watch on the rest of the international friendlies or international games would be the only thing I'm going to be thinking about because once we get to Friday, I would be looking at the 1 week punt and then wildcarding in Game Week 10.
Yeah,
I
makes
think
sense.
yours is even easier, right? Because you just wildcarded,
Yeah.
you just want to relax and not look at any transfers, right?
Yeah, I believe the exact quote um I sent to a friend yesterday was spending a free transfer after a wild card is odd behavior. But I mean, who knows? I could be one or two injuries away from doing it because it's not like I have a very deep bench this week.
Mm.
And maybe Simakas could be calling just in case. But no, I don't have any plans right now. And
Mm.
hopefully Richarlison will, recover from whatever Brazilian game he plays, gets that 2 extra days rest, and hopefully just starts ahead of Brennan Johnson just for that one last week so he can send me off. And if it doesn't happen, you know what? I just hope for a Saka price drop so I can go straight out of Richarlison, straight out of Son, and go Martinelli Saka, which I can
Ooh,
afford now.
that sounds spicy.
So
That
yeah,
sounds spicy. I think Martinelli is going to be a big part of the conversation
I
when
think so. I
KP10
mean,
comes
I
around.
didn't actually know that he
Yeah,
dropped to 7.7. It's quite
yeah,
crazy
yeah, yeah, yeah,
to actually
yeah.
have seen that because now he's gonna give you a lot of diversity. Where previously I was only really thinking about Saka and Odegaard. I mean, Gabriel is at 4.7 first of all,
Yeah.
and if you don't, let's say, rate Arsenal's defensive fixtures, you can always pick him up on Gameweek 14. But from an offensive point of view, I think Martinelli and Saka could be just as brilliant because for me the upside is actually keeping Trippier, which I'm okay with it. As I said, it's a decision
Mm,
between Trippier and Son, and I don't think
mm.
one necessarily is clear above the other.
Yeah, absolutely. So, speaking of semicars, Kalinixta, and have a good rest of your week.
All right, take care, guys, and I'll see you guys in a bit.